The heavy, swinging oak doors of the grand ballroom's kitchen possessed a rhythm. Push, swing, click. Push, swing, click. Every 14 seconds, a frantic waiter clad in an immaculate white tuxedo jacket would burst through those doors, balancing towering silver trays of beluga caviar, gold leaf-encrusted filet mignon, and flutes of imported vintage champagne. And every 14 seconds, the heavy brass hinges of those doors would violently slam into the back of my folding wooden chair. I was 72 years old, dressed in a sharply tailored, albeit classic, navy wool suit that I had ironed myself that morning. I was the patriarch of the family, the grandfather of the groom, and yet I was seated at table 84. Table 84 was not draped in the same cascading, hand-woven silk linens as the rest of the tables in the sprawling, obscenely expensive ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. It was a flimsy, collapsible catering table tucked entirely behind a towering fake marble pillar, effectively hiding me from the view of the remaining 350 elite guests. There was no crystal centerpiece. There was no embossed menu. I was seated next to a busboy on his break, a frantic sous chef scrolling through his phone, and a stack of dirty, discarded appetizer plates that smelled faintly of sour cream and wilted dill. They had placed me at the help table. Through the narrow gap between the pillar and the towering floral arrangements of rare imported white orchids, I could see the head table. I could see my daughter-in-law, Victoria. She was draped in a custom-fitted gown that cost more than most people's homes, her neck heavy with diamonds, holding court like a reigning monarch. Next to her sat my son, Richard, looking weak, complacent, and perfectly molded into the spineless accessory Victoria had always demanded he be. And then there was my grandson, Julian, the groom. The boy I had taught to fish, the boy I had quietly paid for when his parents had squandered his college fund on luxury vacations to St. Bart's and bespoke sports cars. Julian was beaming, clinking his crystal champagne flute with his new bride, laughing at a joke made by one of his wealthy, superficial groomsmen. I sat in the shadows, my hands resting calmly on the handle of my polished mahogany cane. I didn't cry. The time for tears had dried up decades ago, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. I simply watched. Suddenly, the sharp, unmistakable clacking of Christian Louboutin heels echoed over the din of the kitchen behind me. Victoria materialized from the crowd, a glass of Pinot Noir in her perfectly manicured hand. Her eyes, cold and sharp as obsidian glass, swept over my table. The busboy beside me awkwardly scrambled to stand, but Victoria didn't even acknowledge his existence. Her predatory gaze was locked entirely on me. "Elias," she sneered, her voice a hushed, venomous whisper designed to humiliate me without drawing the attention of her high society friends. "I see you found your seat." "Right by the dishwasher, Victoria," I replied evenly, my voice smooth, deep, and entirely devoid of the intimidation she so desperately craved. A rather fascinating choice for the grandfather of the groom, wouldn't you say? Victoria took a slow sip of her wine, her lips curling into a cruel, mocking smirk. "Let's be brutally honest, Elias. You don't belong out there. Look at you. You reek of middle-class mediocrity. Julian's new in-laws are venture capitalists. They own half of Manhattan. I couldn't risk you rambling on about your pathetic little garden, or your outdated morals, or whatever it is you old people do to ruin the aesthetic of a high-net-worth event. You fit in much better back here with the rest of the staff. Eat your bread roll, keep your head down, and when the cake is cut, I suggest you call a cab." She turned on her heel to leave, but stopped when a sudden hush fell over the room. The low murmur of the 300 guests vanished. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. I looked past the marble pillar and saw why. Julian, the groom, had stood up from the head table. He had grabbed a silver spoon and was clinking it against his champagne glass. Clink, clink, clink. The sound echoed like gunshots in the cavernous, opulent ballroom. My heart did a strange, unfamiliar flutter. A microscopic sliver of hope dared to surface in my chest. Julian sees it, I thought. My grandson sees the indignity. He is going to call out his mother. He is going to demand I be brought to the head table where I belong. Julian grabbed the microphone. He looked out over the sea of wealthy elites, his perfectly styled hair catching the light of the massive, glittering chandeliers above. Then, his eyes locked onto the dark corner where I sat. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian spoke, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Before we continue this incredible evening, my beautiful mother just pointed out a slight disruption in the room's energy." He smirked, a carbon copy of his mother's venomous expression. He stepped down from the dais, walking slowly toward the kitchen doors. The entire ballroom turned their heads, their diamond earrings and Rolex watches flashing in the light as they followed his gaze right to my flimsy, wobbling table. "You see, we have a guest who couldn't quite afford to keep up with the family legacy," Julian announced, his voice dripping with condescension. The crowd chuckled, a low, rolling wave of mocking laughter. My grandfather, Elias, seated back there with the dirty dishes. "Grandpa, I just wanted to publicly say, thank you for not embarrassing us tonight by trying to mingle. Enjoy the scraps. It's exactly what you deserve for being so remarkably unremarkable." The ballroom erupted into cruel, uproarious laughter. Victoria was clapping. Richard, my own flesh and blood, was staring at his plate, too coward to look me in the eye. 160 of the most powerful people in the city were pointing, laughing, and whispering at the pathetic old man banished to the kitchen. But I did not scream. I did not shrink down in my chair. I did not beg for their love, nor did I storm out in a fit of emotional devastation. Instead, I smiled. It was a slow, terrifyingly calm smile. The kind of smile a predator gives before the jaws snap shut. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit, a suit that Victoria thought was off the rack but was actually hand-stitched by a master tailor in Milan, and I pulled out my sleek black smartphone. I opened an encrypted application, bypassing the biometric security with my thumbprint. They thought I was a pathetic, retired mechanic who scraped by on a meager pension. They thought the massive trust funds they had been draining for the last decade came from some anonymous, deceased great-uncle. They had absolutely no idea that Elias Thorne was not a helpless old man. They had no idea that I was the silent, absolute majority shareholder of Raspberry Holdings, the private equity firm that owned the very hotel they were standing in, the catering company that made their food, and the massive lines of credit that funded their fake plastic lives. With one calm, steady swipe of my finger across the screen, I was about to turn this $1 million wedding into a devastating, inescapable funeral for their entire social and financial existence. Before I show you exactly how I turned my grandson's $1 million dream wedding into the most humiliating financial and social nightmare of his entitled life, I need to stop and ask you something. Look at that scene for a moment. Look at an old man, a father, a grandfather, shoved into a dark corner next to a kitchen swinging door, treated like a rotting piece of furniture by the very bloodline he sacrificed everything to build. Have you ever felt that specific, burning sting of betrayal? Have you ever sat in a room full of your own relatives, surrounded by the people who are biologically supposed to love, honor, and protect you, only to realize that they view you as nothing more than a burden, or worse, a walking, breathing ATM that they only tolerate when they need something. If you have ever been the scapegoat of your family, if you have ever had to bite your tongue and swallow your pride while toxic, narcissistic relatives paraded around acting superior, then I need you to listen very closely to this story. Because tonight is not just my revenge. Tonight is for you. Tell me in the comments below exactly where in the world you are watching from. I want to see the global footprint of people who have survived narcissistic family abuse. And if you have ever had to set a ruthless, unbreakable boundary to teach a toxic family member a lesson they will never, ever forget, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel. We are building a community of survivors here. People who refuse to be victims. People who understand that blood does not give anyone a free pass to disrespect you. Now, let's rewind the clock. Because to truly understand the sheer magnitude of the absolute devastation I was about to rain down upon Victoria, Richard, and Julian, you have to understand the 30 years of arrogant delusion that led them right into my trap. My hands are calloused. They are rough, scarred, and permanently lined with the faint, indelible shadows of industrial engine grease that no amount of expensive pumice stone or imported soap will ever completely wash away. For 45 years, I woke up at 4 a.m. I laced up heavy, steel-toed boots, drank black coffee from a chipped thermos, and built a regional auto parts manufacturing company from a single, freezing, drafty garage in Queens into a sprawling, multi-state empire. I bled onto concrete floors so that my family would never have to know the suffocating grip of poverty. But my late wife, Eleanor, God rest her soul, had a fatal flaw. She could not bear to see our only son, Richard, experience a single second of struggle. Richard was born into the comfort that my broken back had provided, and Eleanor ensured he was swaddled in it until it completely smothered his spine. He was the classic, quintessential golden child. While I was working 80-hour weeks, negotiating union contracts and expanding supply chains, Eleanor was treating Richard like a fragile porcelain prince. If he failed a test in middle school, it was the teacher's fault. If he quit the baseball team because the coach yelled at him, Eleanor praised his sensitivity. He never held a summer job. He never mowed the lawn. He never knew the profound, character-building satisfaction of earning a single dollar with his own two hands. By the time Richard reached adulthood, he was a beautifully dressed, articulate, and completely useless human being. He was a man made of marshmallows, soft and easily melted by the slightest application of heat or pressure. And that weakness is exactly what attracted Victoria. Victoria came from a family of status-obsessed social climbers who had the pedigree but had squandered their actual wealth decades ago. She smelled the soft, unearned money on Richard like a shark smelling a drop of blood in the Pacific Ocean. When they married, the dynamic of our family violently shifted. Victoria took one look at me, a man who preferred well-worn denim to tailored tuxedos, a man who drove a reliable 10-year-old Ford truck instead of a leased Mercedes, and decided I was a shameful, embarrassing relic. To her, I wasn't the man funding their lifestyle. I was a dirty, blue-collar stain on her perfectly curated country club aesthetic. When Eleanor passed away 12 years ago, the disrespect went from passive-aggressive whispers to blatant, suffocating cruelty. I sold my manufacturing company for a sum so large, it requires 2 commas, rolling the vast majority of it into a private equity firm I named Raspberry Holdings. But I never told Richard and Victoria the true amount. I knew that if they saw the raw numbers, their greed would consume whatever was left of their humanity. So, I created a blind trust. I arranged for a prominent, stiff-suited wealth management firm in Manhattan to act as the face of the trust. To Richard and Victoria, the money came from a rigid, faceless corporate entity dispensing a generous but strictly allocated monthly allowance left behind by Eleanor and myself. They thought my personal wealth was merely a modest pension. They thought I was a retired, lower-middle-class mechanic living in a small condo. And because they thought I was poor, they treated me like absolute garbage. The memories of their abuse are etched into my mind like acid burns on glass. I remember Julian's 16th birthday party. He was the next generation of the golden child, a carbon copy of Victoria's entitlement and Richard's cowardice. I had spent months tracking down a beautifully restored vintage 1968 Mustang, a classic car I had spent weeks personally tuning in a rented garage just for him. When I handed him the keys in front of his wealthy, snickering private school friends, Julian didn't even smile. He looked at the heavy, classic metal key, then looked at his mother. Victoria had scoffed, swirling her martini. "Oh, Elias, that's sweet. But Julian is getting a brand new Range Rover tomorrow. We can't have him driving around in some noisy old second-hand rust bucket. It's a safety hazard. Just park it on the street, would you?" Julian had dropped the keys into the dirt at my feet and walked away, laughing with his friends. I had picked up the keys, my old joints aching, and drove the car away. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I simply added the incident to the ledger. As the years bled on, their lifestyle bloated to grotesque proportions. Victoria demanded complete renovations of their multi-million-dollar estate every 3 years. Richard invested in 4 different tech startups run by his country club buddies, bankrupting every single one of them. Julian's Ivy League tuition, his luxury loft in the city, his designer clothes, his exotic vacations to Dubai and Monaco. It was a hemorrhaging artery of cash. And every time they overdrew their accounts, every time the repo men hovered near Victoria's Porsche, Richard would make a pathetic, whining phone call to the trustees, begging for an emergency disbursement. Because I controlled Raspberry Holdings, I authorized every single one of those bailouts. I let them gorge themselves. I let them build a towering, majestic house of cards. I let them sign their names to millions of dollars in personal liability, using the trust as their infinite collateral. I was giving them the rope, and they were greedily, joyfully wrapping it around their own necks. Meanwhile, their treatment of me became entirely inhumane. I was no longer invited to Thanksgiving dinner. I was told to drop off a pie and leave because they didn't have enough seats at the main table. When I had a mild heart scare and spent 2 nights in the hospital, neither Richard, Victoria, nor Julian came to visit. Victoria sent a text message reading, "Hope you feel better, Elias. Very busy week with Julian's finals. The nurses will take care of you." I was the invisible foundation holding up their diamond-encrusted castle, and they spat on me every single day. They truly believed I was a weak, pathetic old man who was completely powerless. They believed that because I stayed silent, I was ignorant. They believed that the massive wealth they paraded around was their birthright, and that my purpose was simply to quietly rot away in the background so they wouldn't have to look at my calloused hands. But as I sat there at table 84, banished to the kitchen doors, watching my grandson hold a microphone and publicly humiliate me for being remarkably unremarkable, to the roaring applause of 160 elites, the time for observation officially ended. The ledger was full. The debts were being called in. The laughter in the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria was a physical entity. It rolled over the tables, bounced off the towering marble pillars, and crashed against my chest like a relentless, suffocating wave. 350 of Manhattan's elite, hedge fund managers, venture capitalists, socialites draped in conflict-free diamonds and silk, were roaring with amusement at the pathetic old man banished to the kitchen doors. Julian stood on the dais, the microphone hanging loosely in his hand, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his perfectly contoured face. He looked at his mother, Victoria, who was raising her glass of vintage Pinot Noir in a silent, mocking salute. My son, Richard, was staring intently at his imported Wagyu beef, entirely complicit in his silence. They thought they had won. They thought this was the final, definitive stroke that would put me in my place forever. I looked down at the glowing screen of my smartphone. The application for Raspberry Holdings was open. The master control dashboard for the Thorn Family Blind Trust was loaded. I hovered my thumb over the bright red icon labeled Liquidate and Freeze. Then I put the phone back into my tailored breast pocket. If I was going to strip them of their entire existence, I was not going to do it from the shadows of Table 84. I was going to do it in the light. I gripped the polished brass head of my mahogany cane. I didn't need it to walk. My daily routine of swimming and weightlifting had kept me in excellent physical condition. But it was a prop I had used for years to feed their delusion of my frailty. I pushed my chair back. It scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, a harsh, grating sound that momentarily pierced through the fading laughter of the crowd. I stood up. I didn't hunch my shoulders. I didn't tremble. For the first time in over a decade, I allowed my true posture to take form. I pulled my shoulders back, lifted my chin, and let the sheer, unyielding weight of my authority settle over my frame. The bespoke Italian tailoring of my suit, previously hidden by my slouched demeanor, suddenly looked impeccably sharp, cutting a formidable silhouette. I began to walk. Clack, step, clack, step. The heavy thud of my cane against the floor kept a steady, rhythmic, almost militaristic beat. As I stepped out from behind the fake floral arrangements and the marble pillar, the murmurs of the crowd began to shift. The wealthy guests seated at the back tables turned around, their smiles faltering as they took in the sight of me. I wasn't scurrying out the back door in shame. I was walking directly toward the head table. "Oh, for God's sake!" I heard Victoria hiss through the microphone, which Julian had carelessly left turned on. "Security! Someone get security! He's going to make a scene!" Julian's smirk vanished, replaced by an ugly scowl of irritation. He stepped forward, raising his free hand as if to swat away a fly. "Grandpa, sit down. The joke is over. Don't make this more embarrassing than it already is." I didn't stop. I walked right down the center aisle, the heavy crystal chandeliers casting long, dramatic shadows across my path. The sea of guests parted, an uneasy silence falling over the room as my presence demanded absolute attention. When I reached the base of the dais, I looked up at my grandson. "You are absolutely right, Julian," I said, my voice deep, resonant, and entirely stripped of the gentle, elderly waver I had affected for years. It boomed through the room without the need for a microphone. "The joke is entirely over." I didn't wait for an invitation. I walked up the short flight of velvet-carpeted stairs and stepped onto the dais. I walked directly past Julian, ignoring his stammering protests, and approached the center of the table where Victoria and Richard sat. Victoria's face was flushed with absolute fury. "Elias, you have lost your mind," Victoria spat, her voice a venomous whisper, mindful of the hundreds of eyes watching them. "Get off this stage before I have you physically thrown into the street." "You couldn't afford the security guards required to throw me out, Victoria," I replied calmly. I reached over and snatched the microphone from Julian's hand before he could react. The speakers let out a sharp, piercing whine of feedback that made several guests wince and cover their ears. Total, breathless silence descended upon the ballroom. "Good evening, everyone," I spoke into the microphone, my voice smooth, commanding, and laced with absolute ice. My name is Elias Thorne. I am the man Julian just so eloquently thanked for being unremarkable. I am the man Victoria deemed unfit to sit among you, banished to the kitchen so my mediocrity wouldn't ruin her aesthetic. I slowly paced the length of the head table, my eyes locking onto the wealthy investors and socialites in the audience. Victoria and Richard have painted a very specific picture for all of you, I continued, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. They have presented themselves as titans of industry, old money, elite investors. They have hosted you in their sprawling $15 million estate in the Hamptons. They have invited you on their yacht in Saint-Tropez. They have paraded my grandson Julian around as the heir to a massive, generational fortune. I stopped right behind Richard's chair. My son was sweating profusely, his face pale, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered rat. But you see, there is a fundamental flaw in their narrative, I said, leaning closer to the microphone. Every single dime, every drop of champagne you are drinking tonight, the caviar you just swallowed, the very tuxedo on the groom's back, does not belong to them. It belongs to a blind trust administered by a private equity firm called Raspberry Holdings. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw Julian's new father-in-law, a ruthless venture capitalist named Arthur Sterling, narrow his eyes and lean forward in his seat. For 12 years, my son and his wife have drained this trust, I announced to the room. They have accumulated over $42 million in personal debt, collateralized entirely by the assumed infinite grace of this faceless corporate entity. They believed their wealth was a magic well that would never run dry. They believed they were untouchable. Victoria stood up, her face a mask of absolute panic and rage. "Turn off his microphone! He's senile! He has dementia!" she shrieked, her carefully cultivated high society voice cracking into a shrill, ugly squawk. "I assure you, my mind is sharper than it has ever been," I countered smoothly, my voice completely drowning hers out. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Because what Victoria, Richard, and Julian do not know, what they have been too arrogant, too self-absorbed, and too foolish to ever investigate, is exactly who owns Raspberry Holdings. The silence in the room was no longer just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. You could hear a pin drop on the thick carpets. I looked down at Victoria. Her eyes were wide, the color completely draining from her face as the realization began to claw its way into her brain. Richard let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. "I built a manufacturing empire with my bare hands," I stated, my voice ringing with undeniable power. "I sold it for hundreds of millions of dollars. I am the sole proprietor, the CEO, and the absolute majority shareholder of Raspberry Holdings. I am the bank. I am the trust. I own your house, Victoria. I own your cars, Julian. I own the diamond necklace currently resting against your throat." Julian let out a nervous, disbelieving laugh. "You're lying," he choked out. "You're a retired mechanic. You live in a condo. You don't have that kind of money." "I lived in a condo because I don't need a $15 million mansion to know my worth, boy," I snapped back, my eyes flashing with decades of suppressed fury. "I allowed you to use my money because I wanted to see what kind of people you truly were when you thought no one was holding you accountable. And you have proven yourselves to be nothing more than cruel, hollow parasites." I held my phone up for them to see. The dashboard was glowing brightly in the dim light of the chandeliers. "Blood does not equal a blank check," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "And your account is permanently closed." With one firm, decisive motion, I pressed my thumb against the screen. I hit liquidate, and freeze. The immediate aftermath of a financial execution is not loud. It does not explode. It simply collapses, like a massive skyscraper whose foundation has been completely atomized in a single second. The moment my thumb left the screen, an automated encrypted directive was instantly transmitted from the Raspberry holding servers to every major financial institution connected to my son's family. Credit cards were instantly deactivated. Lines of credit were severed. Asset seizure protocols were automatically triggered, and real-time alerts were dispatched to the vendors currently operating the wedding. For about 10 seconds, nothing happened. The crowd stared in stunned, breathless silence. Victoria was clutching her diamond necklace, her chest heaving, trying to formulate a sentence that wouldn't make her look like a complete fraud. Then, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open, not with the rhythm of waiters, but with the frantic, terrified urgency of management. Mr. Sterling, the general manager of the Waldorf Astoria, practically sprinted into the room. He bypassed the confused guests, ignoring the pristine white runner of the aisle, and marched directly up to the dais. He was clutching a tablet, his face pale with panic. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at Victoria. He walked straight up to me and bowed his head in a gesture of absolute, terrified respect. "Mr. Thorne," Sterling said, his voice trembling slightly, yet loud enough for the microphone to pick up every word. "Sir, I just received the high-priority alert from your office. I had no idea you were in attendance. If we had known the owner of the firm holding the hotel's debt was here, we would have—" "It is quite all right, Mr. Sterling," I replied smoothly, projecting an aura of absolute control. "I prefer to travel unannounced. What is the status of the event?" Sterling swallowed hard, turning his tablet around. "Sir, the primary payment method on file for this entire reception, the Thorn Trust Platinum accounts, they have just returned a hard decline, code 04. The accounts have been frozen, and we have received a direct asset seizure notice from the central bank." Victoria let out a blood-curdling shriek. "That is impossible! Run it again! You run my card right now, you incompetent fool!" Sterling stiffened, turning to Victoria with a look of sudden, cold corporate detachment. "Ma'am, the system is hard-locked. Your secondary cards, your personal black card, and Mr. Richards' corporate cards have all been instantly revoked. As of this exact second, this $1 million reception is entirely unfunded." The ballroom erupted. It was absolute chaos. The 160 wealthy guests, the people Victoria had spent a decade desperately trying to impress, began whispering, pointing, and gasping in horrific delight. High society is a blood sport, and they had just been given front row seats to the most spectacular execution in the city's history. Julian's bride, Chloe, stood up from the table. She looked at Julian, her face contorted in sheer disgust. Her father, the venture capitalist, marched up to the stage. "You broke, fraudulent pieces of trash," Chloe's father spat, glaring at Richard and Victoria. He grabbed his daughter by the arm. "I knew there was something off about your portfolio, Richard. You've been funding this entire circus with Daddy's money, and you don't even have a dime to your name." "Arthur, please, wait! It's a misunderstanding!" Richard begged, literally falling to his knees and grasping at the man's tuxedo jacket. It was the most pathetic display of cowardice I had ever witnessed. "He's just angry! I can fix this!" "Get your hands off me, you parasite!" Arthur snarled, kicking Richard's hands away. Chloe ripped the 5-carat engagement ring off her finger and threw it directly at Julian's chest. It bounced off his lapel and rolled into a puddle of spilled champagne. "We are leaving," Arthur announced to his side of the family. "This wedding is over." As half the room began to stand up and gather their belongings, the humiliation escalated to catastrophic levels. A man in a sharp gray suit, my personal asset recovery agent, walked through the side doors, flanked by 2 massive security guards. He approached the dais, pulling a stack of legal documents from his briefcase. "Victoria Thorne? Richard Thorne?" the agent asked, his voice ringing with legal finality. "What now?" Victoria sobbed, her perfect makeup running down her face in ugly black streaks. Her pristine facade had completely melted, revealing the terrified, powerless grifter underneath. "Notice of immediate foreclosure and asset seizure," the agent stated, handing the thick packet to a sobbing Richard. "As per the terms of your defaulted loans with Raspberry Holdings, your primary residence in the Hamptons is currently being locked down by our security teams. You have 48 hours to collect your personal clothing. The locks have already been changed." "My house?" Victoria screamed, grabbing her hair. "You can't take my house! I designed that house!" "You didn't pay for it, ma'am," the agent replied coldly. He then turned to Julian, who was standing frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Julian Thorne, I need the keys to the 2025 Aston Martin and the Mercedes G-Wagon currently parked in the valet. The tow trucks are waiting outside." No, Julian stammered, tears welling up in his eyes. The arrogant, cruel boy who had mocked me 10 minutes ago was now crying like a toddler. "I need my car! How am I supposed to get home? My loft!" "Your loft lease, which was guaranteed by the trust, has been terminated due to breach of contract," the agent informed him without an ounce of pity. "You don't have a home, son." The sheer, overwhelming scale of their destruction was beautiful. It was a masterpiece of financial annihilation. In less than 3 minutes, they had gone from the apex of high society luxury to absolute, undeniable destitution. They had no money, no home, no cars, and, most importantly, no social standing. The elite guests they had worshipped were watching them burn, filming the meltdown on their phones, forever immortalizing their disgrace. Victoria looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot, her hands shaking violently. She finally understood. She wasn't looking at a pathetic old man from the kitchen. She was looking at the god of her universe. And he had just turned out the sun. "Elias, please," Victoria whimpered, her voice entirely stripped of its arrogance. It was a pathetic, broken croak. She actually dropped to her knees, staining her $1,000,000 gown on the spilled champagne. "Please, we're family. We'll be on the streets. You can't do this to us. You can't." I looked down at her. I looked at Richard, crying into the carpet. I looked at Julian, trembling and stripped of his bride, his wealth, and his dignity. I felt absolutely nothing but the profound, healing warmth of total justice. "You told me to fit in back in the kitchen, Victoria," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of a judge passing a life sentence. "You told me to eat my scraps, keep my head down, and call a cab. I highly suggest you take your own advice, because as of tonight, scraps are the only thing you will ever be able to afford." Victoria remained on her knees, her tear-soaked face looking up at me, waiting for a reprieve that was never going to come. The spilled, vintage champagne soaked into the delicate silk of her custom gown, staining it a dull, dirty yellow. Richard was entirely paralyzed, his face buried in his hands as the reality of his massive, insurmountable debt finally crushed the breath out of his lungs. And Julian was just staring at the empty space on his finger, where his platinum wedding band was supposed to go. A boy king who had just watched his entire plastic empire burn to ash in under 3 minutes. I looked at the 3 of them. The architects of my misery, the parasites who had happily fed on my life's work while treating me like a disease. For 12 years, I had carried the heavy, suffocating weight of their disrespect. I had swallowed their insults, endured their neglect, and allowed them to banish me to the shadows. But as I stood above them now, under the brilliant, glaring light of the crystal chandeliers, I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel sorrow. I felt lighter than I had in a decade. The chains were gone. I didn't say another word. They didn't deserve another syllable of my time. I turned my back on them. I gripped my mahogany cane, lifted my chin, and began the long walk down the center aisle of the ballroom. The atmosphere had entirely shifted. The same 300 elites who had mocked me and laughed at Julian's cruel jokes just 15 minutes earlier were now dead silent. As I walked, the sea of wealthy socialites, hedge fund managers, and venture capitalists physically parted for me. They stepped back, pulling their chairs out of my way, their eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and profound, undeniable respect. I saw Arthur Sterling, the billionaire venture capitalist who had just pulled his daughter from the wedding, standing near the exit. As I approached, this ruthless titan of industry, a man who destroyed companies for sport, slowly nodded to me, stepping aside to let me pass. I pushed open the heavy, brass-handled mahogany doors of the ballroom and stepped out into the quiet, pristine marble lobby of the Waldorf Astoria. Behind me, the doors swung shut, instantly cutting off the frantic, high-pitched shrieks of Victoria arguing with the asset recovery agents. The silence of the lobby was beautiful. I walked out through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the crisp, cool Manhattan night air. The city was alive, humming with neon lights and the distant wail of sirens. But my mind was completely, perfectly still. I walked up to the valet stand and silently handed the young attendant a small, heavy metal key. "Bring her around, son," I said, slipping him a crisp $100 bill. 2 minutes later, the deep, guttural, earth-shaking roar of a massive V8 engine echoed down Park Avenue. The valet pulled up to the curb and stepped out, leaving the door open for me. It was the vintage 1968 Mustang. The exact same car I had spent weeks restoring with my own 2 hands, bleeding onto the garage floor. The exact same car Julian had called a noisy old rust bucket before dropping the keys in the dirt at my feet. It was immaculate, its midnight blue paint gleaming like a polished sapphire under the streetlights. I stood by the open door. I looked down at the mahogany cane in my hand, the prop I had used for so long to make them feel comfortable in their delusion of my weakness. I smiled, a genuine warm smile, and tossed the cane casually into the passenger seat. I didn't need it anymore. I never really did. I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the worn leather steering wheel. The engine vibrated through my bones, a glorious mechanical symphony of pure power. I pulled the gear shift into drive and pressed my foot on the accelerator. As I pulled away from the curb, I looked into the rearview mirror. 3 massive, heavy-duty tow trucks with flashing yellow strobe lights were aggressively pulling into the hotel's circular driveway, blocking off the entrance. The drivers were jumping out, entirely ignoring the frantic hotel staff and hooking massive steel chains to Julian's Mercedes G-Wagon and Victoria's leased Porsche. I watched the flashing yellow lights shrink in the mirror. I watched the grand facade of the hotel fade into the distance. I watched the toxic, parasitic leeches who had tried to destroy me completely vanish into the darkness. I rolled the window down, letting the cold, refreshing wind whip through the cabin. I drove out of the city, heading toward a peaceful, quiet, and entirely free future, leaving them to drown in the absolute ruin they had built for themselves. They weaponize the word family. They use it as a shield to deflect accountability, and they use it as a sword to bleed you dry. From the moment we are born, society conditions us to believe that sharing DNA is a sacred, unbreakable bond. We are told to forgive the unforgivable, to swallow our pride, and to endlessly finance the delusions of toxic relatives simply because we share a last name. But I am here to tell you the absolute, undeniable truth. Blood does not equal a blank check. Your success, your peace of mind, and your financial security are the direct results of your sacrifice, your tears, and your sleepless nights. You did not build your empire, whether it is a billion-dollar equity firm or simply a quiet, comfortable life you carved out for yourself, to serve as the emergency fund for people who do not respect you. When you allow toxic family members to treat you like a disposable resource, when you let them banish you to the dark corners of the room while they parade around in the light you paid for, you are not being loyal. You are funding your own abuse. Walking away from family is one of the hardest things a human being can ever do. It goes against everything we are taught. But let me make this perfectly clear. Cutting off a narcissistic, parasitic relative is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and you cannot save people who are actively trying to drown you to stay afloat. When I pressed that button and liquidated my family's entire fake existence, I didn't ruin their lives. I simply removed myself as their safety net, and gravity did the rest. If you are watching this right now, and you are exhausted from carrying the weight of ungrateful, toxic family members, if you are tired of being the scapegoat, the bank, and the punching bag, I give you permission to walk away. Take your power back. Let their house of cards collapse, because the moment you stop funding their chaos, you will finally have the capital to invest in your own peace. I want to hear from you. Look down into the comments right now and share your story. Have you ever had to look a toxic family member in the eye and permanently cut the cord? How did it feel when you finally set that unbreakable boundary and walked away? Your story, your survival, might be the exact spark someone else reading the comments needs to finally break their own chains today. If my story resonated with you, if you believe in absolute justice and the power of knowing your worth, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. We are not just telling stories here. We are building a global community of strong, independent survivors who refuse to be victims anymore. Never apologize for protecting your peace. Never let anyone, especially family, make you feel small. And remember, the best revenge is not just success. It is watching them realize entirely too late exactly who they messed with. I will see you in the next video.